Crime stories about children have always been my kryptonite. I find them very hard to cover no matter how complex or straightforward the cases are. And yes, I do find cases of gender based violence equally difficult, but at least I have my feminist rage to fuel and sustain me in my research and writing. But with kids, I immediately go to a very dark place. I imagine myself as a child and how I would feel if I had gone through the same ordeal as those victims and survivors of crime cases. But I find it even more difficult and, in this regard, infuriating when cases involving children are handled so badly by the adults in powers that families and, in some cases, the children themselves are left heartbroken and emotionally shattered by the system that was supposed to deliver justice to those who were wronged. And this is no different in the case I'm about to share with you. This is the case of Ellah Joy Pique. Hi, Lagim fam. Welcome to our anniversary episode. Lagim Podcast turned officially 1 year old on the 4th of December 2021. I cannot believe I have not given up yet. I truly enjoy producing this content and engaging with our little community here. Stay tuned until the end of this episode for a few more personal thoughts on this incredible milestone. As always, details in this story can be very upsetting and disturbing for some people. So please take care of yourself whilst listening. Before it became Minglanilla, named after a municipality in La Mancha, Spain, the town was called Buat. In Cebuano, Buat or Buad means to dry. Buat was the place where fishermen dried their sea catches before selling them off to the local townspeople. By 1858, and thanks to our Spanish colonizers, Buat became Minglanilla. Today it is part of Metro Cebu and overlooks Bohol on the east. It is also known as the Sugat capital of the South and the venue for a festival called Kabanhawan, meaning resurrection, which is held annually on Easter, both of which have something to do with how Minglanilla spectacularly celebrates the risen Christ. People are able to watch a reenactment of Jesus Christ reuniting with his mother Mary after he resurrected, hence the word Sugat, Cebuano for meeting or reuniting. Currently, Minglanilla is home to around 150,000 people. And in 2011, one of the many Minglanillians who lived peacefully and quietly in this historic town was a 6-year-old girl called Ellah Joy Pique. On Tuesday, the 8th of February 2011, Ella started her day like any school kid her age. After getting ready at home, she went to school, the Kalahoan Elementary School in Minglanilla. At lunch, she went back home to eat and was still able to talk to her father, Renante, who told her that, unfortunately, he would not be able to pick her up from school later on like he always did. He needed to run some urgent errands. I suppose Ella's school was not far away from her home, and like many kids in the Philippines who live within walking distance of their schools, Ella was used to walking with friends and classmates to and from school. So, at the time, Renante did not really think this was going to be a big deal. By the time 4 p.m. came that day, school ended and it was time to finally get home quickly. Knowing that no one would pick her up that day, Ella walked home with her friends, which included 2 twin boys. Not long after the children started walking, a black car pulled up beside Ella and her friends. From what we now know, It seems like Ella was offered two 50 peso bills and was asked to get into the car with two adults who were unknown to anyone at that point. Ella accepted the money and got into the car, leaving her friends behind, who wondered if they'd see her again tomorrow at school. Back at Ella's family home, Renante Pique finally arrived home from running errands and fully expected to see daughter Ella already settling down for the evening, but Ella was nowhere to be found. Renante presumably felt like something was very wrong about his daughter not being at home and probably panicked, knowing that his 6-year-old daughter could be in danger. We now know that the Pique family reported their daughter missing that very same afternoon. The police took on the report whilst Renante and the rest of the family could not really do more than wait for the police to make moves in searching for Ella. Renante would later recount how at 2 in the morning on the 9th of February, he walked around Calahoan hoping to find his daughter. He said he could not sleep, thinking of all the things that could have happened to her. The day after, on the 10th, he went to his workplace to print out pictures of Ella in the hope that by distributing her image all over their town, he would be able to generate not only interest in the case but also leads. Earlier that day, a beach caretaker and several residents of another barangay called Barangay Gibuangan in the town of Barili noticed what looked like a package wrapped in white cloth tied together with wires. It looked like the package was thrown off a cliff and into a ravine. It was first thought to contain a dead pig or perhaps a dog, but the residents of the barangay quickly realized that they were dealing with the body of a child, given the size of the package. The police were immediately alerted, and when they eventually responded, they did a preliminary inspection. They would later report that the wrapped package in fact contained the body of a naked little girl who was drenched with what was believed to be her own blood. Coincidentally, a few kilometers away in Barangay Palupat, a school bag was found. It contained a school uniform, underwear, books, notebooks, and two 50 peso bills. It did not take a long time for the police to think that the girl in the ravine could be Ellah Joy Pique, the same girl who was reported missing not more than 48 hours ago, and that the school bag found a few kilometers away belonged to her. An official identification still had to be made. After the police were done with their initial processing of the crime scene, the body from the ravine was removed and transported to a funeral home in Ronda, Cebu. A little while later, over in Minglanilla, Renante, after printing out pictures of his missing daughter, made a stop at the police station where he was finally told that a body had been found in the town of Barili. This moment must have been absolutely horrifying for Renante, knowing that the body was that of a young girl that vaguely matched Ella's features and age. Despite feeling the dread in him, he went with the police to the police station in Barili to identify the school bag. It was his daughter's. Renante broke down and cried at the sight of his daughter's belongings, but he needed to still be taken to the funeral home in Ronda to make a formal identification of the body from the ravine. Reports at the time would state that Renante cried in horror when he was finally allowed to see his daughter. He was visibly in agony, asking who could have done this to his Ella. He then expressed guilt for not picking her up from school 2 days ago. On the same day, Ella's body was brought back to her home of Minglanilla, where family and friends greeted her with tears and visible signs of regret. Her mother, Ligaya, was inconsolable. Her grief was so immense that she refused to believe the body found in Barili was that of her daughters. Reports would state that Ligaya shrieked when she saw Ella's face, saying that it was not her daughter's, that her face did not look like that. Her reaction was understandable because it was visible for everyone that Ella sustained major injuries, causing her face to bloat beyond recognition. Whilst the Pique family and their relatives were finding it hard to come to grips with this horrible loss of life, the police in Minglanilla started their investigation. Around 3 days into their investigation, they were able to find at least 5 witnesses, 2 of whom were the twin boys Ella was with when she was abducted. Their account, along with the others, were used to determine who the abductors were. A police sketch of the 2 adults in the black car were put together with the help of the twin boys. It would seem from their description that the abductors were a Caucasian man with tattoos and a Filipino woman. The sketch was immediately passed on to all police authorities in Metro Cebu. By the 12th of February, a Norwegian man and a Filipino woman were apprehended as they were going through immigration checks at Mactan International Airport. 49-year-old Sven Eric Berger and his fiancée Karen Castro Esdrelon were then transported to the Cebu Provincial Police Office for questioning. By Tuesday afternoon on the 15th of February, the twin boys and other witnesses were brought in to make a formal identification. From the reports at that time, my understanding is that the boys were able to confirm that the couple were the ones who abducted Ellah Joy, but the identification process seemed questionable. The boys apparently saw the couple from behind a one-way mirror, and it does not sound like it was a lineup. If this was the case, the identification was potentially suggestive and therefore prejudicial. The police also were adamant that the cartographic sketch they had matched the couple's appearance, a conclusion that some people doubted. Berger and Esdrelon vehemently denied being involved in Ella's murder. They maintained that they never left Cebu City and didn't even know where Minglanilla or Barili were. Berger also took his shirt off during questioning to show that he did not have any tattoos, which was something that the twin boys remembered of the Caucasian man who abducted Ella. The Norwegian computer engineer and the Filipino nurse were on their way to Hong Kong to celebrate Valentine's and to spend some time together. They were also newly engaged and claimed that at the time of the incident, they spent their day and night at the waterfront hotel. Now, charges were not filed just yet, and it seemed that the police, or some members of the police force, were not so convinced themselves anymore that the couple were the couple who took Ella. Meanwhile, Berger was provided with a lawyer by the Norwegian embassy who made it clear to the police and the media that if no charges were filed, the police needed to release his client and Miss Esdrelon before they became liable for illegal detention. The lawyer, Salvador Solima, criticized the police for basing their arrests on a pair of sketches and the identification of 2 children. He even suggested that the children were perhaps brainwashed by the police, who were desperate to find the culprit of Ella's murder. Of course, Solima needed to say these things as Berger's lawyer, but stripping his suggestions and insinuations down, he very well may have had a point. Eyewitness accounts by adults have been proven problematic and at times unreliable because our brains simply do not just record memories and faces like a video camera does. Our brains are suggestible and we can easily mistake things and people for others. This is even more of a problem when it comes to eyewitnesses who saw someone or needed to identify someone of a different race, also called cross racial identification. If a person is not used to interacting with a person of a different race for whatever reason, the witness might not be able to distinguish one person of that race from another. I will link in the show notes an interesting article from the Washington University Jurisprudence Review that talks about this very problem. Essentially, studies of this problem are not saying that people who cannot differentiate different faces of a certain race are racist or prejudiced. The baseline conclusion of these studies is that we are better at recognizing faces that belong to our race because we are more used to them. So, the twin boys who were supposed to have identified Berger without a doubt should definitely have been given the chance to identify him in a lineup instead of just a view from behind a one-way mirror. Having said all that, charges were eventually filed against the couple and they were detained as a result, but of course, the story does not end there. By March 2011, and perhaps as expected, both Berger and Esdrelon were let go from detention for lack of probable cause. This was a result of CCTV footage submitted by the NBI that showed how the couple was 10 kilometers away from where Ella was abducted on the 8th of February. Cebu's Governor Gwen Garcia expressed frustration and a loss of confidence in the police superintendent responsible for the case. It seemed like the police never tried to verify the claims made by Berger and Esdrelon as to their whereabouts and proceeded with the charges regardless. Shortly after this, the police superintendent resigned and the task force that was formed to solve Ella's case was assigned to a new leader. But inevitably, the police were back at square one. Nevertheless, they did have one lead involving another couple consisting of another Caucasian man and a Filipino woman. New witnesses came forward and were questioned by the police. The investigation led the police to a couple named Ian Griffiths, who is British, and his partner Bella Santos, who is a native of Naga City. The suspicion was that Santos owned the black car, specifically the black Pajero that was used to abduct Ella. The black Pajero was eventually located and seized by the 4th of March 2011 following a search of a house in Naga where Santos was apparently staying. Other objects were also seized following this search. The owner of the house was someone named Chloe Santos, who was presumed to be related to Bella Santos. After the search, the car was then submitted for examination. Evidence from this examination was then submitted to Camp Crame for further investigation and testing. At the same time, the Santoses had filed a motion to have the search warrant used for the search declared null and void, as the warrant only allowed the search of the car and not the house. As a result of this application, Bella Santos made her first public appearance on the 16th of March at the Palace of Justice in Cebu. She sat quietly in court whilst her lawyer was arguing against the validity of the search made at the Santoses' home. Afterwards, Santos briefly spoke to the media and denied being involved in Ella's murder, claiming that she and Griffiths were in Naga at the time of Ella's abduction. Her lawyer presented itinerary receipts of airline tickets bearing the name of Bella Santos and Ian Griffiths. I understand that the couple arrived in Manila from Singapore on the 2nd of February and then landed in Cebu the next day, only to depart for Palawan on the 4th. They both returned to Cebu on the 6th of February to prepare for their trip back to Singapore on the 7th, but unfortunately, they arrived too late and missed their flight. They purchased new tickets, but these were for the 9th of February. According to Santos's lawyer, the couple went back to Naga, spent the rest of the 7th and the 8th of February there before their flight on the 9th. After this appearance in court, Santos was told not to leave Cebu until a case was filed and a warrant of arrest was issued for Ella's kidnapping and murder. I must say that is very odd. Surely, despite not having an arrest warrant yet, there should be measures in place that would prevent her from fleeing the country or even Cebu, but I guess such measures were and are not available. As I understand it, this would not be the last appearance of Santos in court prior to any potential criminal trial at that time. By the 1st of April, PNP Task Force Ella finally felt confident enough to file a complaint for kidnapping with homicide against Ian Griffiths and Bella Santos. The task force also immediately moved to ask the prosecutor's office to apply for a hold and departure order to prevent Santos and Griffiths from leaving the country. Following the announcement by the PNP that they were ready to file a complaint with the prosecutor's office, the media and the public were desperate to know the results of the investigation that finally pushed the PNP to make such a complaint. It was revealed by Senior Superintendent Patronicio Comendador Jr., Cebu's Provincial Police Officer Chief, that the police had worked for 2 months, assembling together all the pieces of evidence they were able to gather, proving that it was Griffiths and Santos who killed Ella. According to the police, their investigation led them to believe that the following account is what happened to Ellah Joy Pique. The police first established that from their investigation, they believed that the house Santos stayed in was a base of cyber sex operations. From that initial finding, the police reconstructed the moments before Ella disappeared until she was found dead on the 8th of February 2011. According to the police, hours before Ella was abducted, Griffiths and Santos boarded a black Pajero and went to Barangay Colon in Naga City. There, they tried to abduct a girl named Sherilyn Repolyo, but she was lucky enough to escape. The police were able to confirm this through a witness who saw the whole incident unfold. Following this failed attempt to abduct someone, the police stated that Santos and Griffiths drove off and made their way to Barangay Calahuan in Minglanilla in search of another victim. A motorcycle driver saw the Pajero driving towards the Calahuan Elementary School. There, they saw Ella walking home. They stopped and talked to her, telling her that they were there to bring her home. 2 witnesses told the police apparently that they saw this incident take place and were also able to identify Santos as the one who took Ella. However, neither of them saw Santos's companion, so they were unable to describe him. A 3rd witness, however, informed the police that he heard the commotion of Ella being taken from the other side of the road and then saw Griffiths, who was apparently driving the Pajero. Furthermore, the police claimed that Griffiths and Santos, having arrived back in Naga with Ella, forced Ella to pose for explicit content by bribing her with food and money. But Ella allegedly refused, and this was unacceptable to her captors. The police concluded that Ella was hit with a blunt object on her head, which led to her death at around 11 o'clock in the evening on the 8th of February. An hour and a half later, and already on the 9th of February at that point, two witnesses passed by Sitio Sayaw, Barangay Gibuangan, Barili, on a motorcycle and saw both Santos and Griffiths dumping something wrapped in a sheet. The witnesses confirmed that they saw the Pajero, the car, whilst the two suspects were dumping this wrapped object that turned out to be Ella's lifeless body. As night turned to day, and as we now know, someone from the same village discovered Ella's body. Meanwhile, we also now know that around 1:30 in the afternoon, in a barangay just a couple minutes away, Ella's belongings were also found. The police also mentioned in their report that both Santos and Griffiths cleaned up all traces of their crime and were getting ready to leave the country by boarding a plane at Mactan Cebu International Airport that same afternoon on the 9th of February. The couple apparently booked a last-minute flight with Silk Air. It was a one-way ticket purchased with cash around 3 p.m. on that same day. The police explained that the identification of Santos and Griffiths was done by comparing the photographs of the suspects with other persons of similar features. The witnesses, who were minors, were placed under the guidance of a qualified social worker and their parents. This would later raise questions because some of the minors who identified Sven Eric Berger and Karen Castro Esdrelon have now changed their minds and have identified both Griffiths and Santos as the couple who abducted Ella. One of the child witnesses would later state that the only reason they identified Berger and Esdrelon as the suspects in this case was because they were apparently influenced by two other witnesses who were very adamant that Berger and Esdrelon were the ones who abducted Ella. The minors said that this time they were sure, as they recognized Santos from a mole on her face and also her sunglasses. The only problem is, or the problem was back then, Bella does not have a mole on her face, at least not a very obvious one. Now, following the news about the intention of the PNP to file a complaint, Bella Ruby Santos appeared in court again as part of an evidentiary hearing. Amongst the things being argued in this hearing was yet again the search warrant for the house where Santos and Griffith stayed. The police, according to Santos's lawyers, overstepped the powers granted by the search warrant, potentially making it an illegal search. With an illegal search, any evidence recovered could be deemed inadmissible when a trial does start. The outcome of this hearing is unclear because the only good article I could find mainly focused on the fact that Santos looked quite overdressed for a court appearance and that she nearly picked a fight with a police officer whom she challenged to a fist fight. However, what I did understand was that the judge in this case was reprimanding the police for at least one thing. He believed they took the wrong car, the wrong Pajero, implying that any evidence taken from that Pajero might end up being irrelevant. This hearing was then adjourned, and it was hoped back then that it could continue soon. It is, however, notable during this hearing that only Santos attended court because, as far as information online goes, Griffiths was already back in England and was also being hunted by the police over there. British news outlets reported on the 5th of April that Griffiths was arrested by the police in London. I am assuming that since there would not have been any hold and departure order before the PNP had filed their case, Griffiths may have taken that opportunity to fly home quickly. After all, there still was no arrest warrant, infuriatingly enough. Santos, on the other hand, most probably did not have a choice but to stay since she probably did not have a visa, nor was she a citizen of the UK, leaving her alone to fight her case. Now, you would think that after the PNP filed a complaint against Santos and Griffiths, and knowing that this had now become a high profile case, the prosecutor's office would do its best to study the case expeditiously in order to reach a decision to indict or not to indict. But no. The prosecutor's office did not announce that they found probable cause to indict Santos and Griffiths until June 2011, around 3 months after Santos first appeared in court in March. As I understand it, the prosecutor's office was convinced enough at this time to allow an indictment because, in their opinion, Santos's witnesses were not consistent in their recollection as to where Santos and Griffiths were on the 8th of February. One witness said the couple never left their room in the afternoon of February the 8th, but another witness said that Santos went out of the room around 3 p.m. that day. Other witnesses said that they didn't see Santos and Griffiths at all in the afternoon of the 8th of February. What was also damning for both Santos and Griffiths was the fact that their counter affidavits did not contain any alternative explanation as to where they were on the afternoon of the 8th of February until the morning of the 9th, therefore raising even more suspicion about their involvement. According to the prosecutor's office, it was not physically impossible to get to where Ella was abducted from where Santos and Griffiths were staying in Naga City. These were, after all, adjacent municipalities. And so, there was probable cause to indict them. As a response, lawyers for Santos and Griffiths vowed to contest this decision, arguing that the evidence by the prosecution was all fabricated and would not stand in a trial. Now, please note that just because a prosecutor found there was probable cause to indict does not mean that an arrest warrant is automatically issued. Again, in this case, no one had eyes on Santos, and Griffiths was back in the UK, a country that does not have an extradition treaty with the Philippines, and still the prosecutors were seemingly taking their sweet time to move things along. In the meantime, the authorities in the Philippines were informed that following his arrest, Griffiths was allowed to post bail but was still under police surveillance after spending 2 nights in jail. As of June 2011, he was still being monitored by UK police and was not allowed to talk to other people except his lawyers, something I doubt was strictly monitored by the UK police, to be quite honest. Now, back in the Philippines, and a day after it was announced that prosecutors were moving forward with an indictment, Santos was reported to have absconded. But weirdly enough, she was still able to give an interview in which she promised to surrender as soon as an arrest warrant was issued. And this warrant was not issued until mid-July 2011. Journalists from the Inquirer who were privy to Santos's mobile phone number from a previous interview perhaps tried to call her but realized quickly that her number was not available anymore. When her lawyers were interviewed and asked about their client's whereabouts, they just said that she was maximizing her privacy, a rather odd way of saying that she was in hiding. In the meantime, her lawyers were getting ready to file an application to ask the court to recall the arrest warrant. Meanwhile, the PNP were also making moves because they needed to find Santos as soon as possible. The court, after all, only gave them 10 days to make this arrest. Now, remember that hold and departure order that the PNP wanted the prosecution to file back in April? Well, that was not filed and heard until July. again risking so much in terms of Santos being able to escape either to another part of the Philippines, but also to any other country that does not require her to have a visa upon entry and that does not have an extradition treaty with the Philippines. When the hold and departure order was finally handed down by the court on the 14th of July, Santos's lawyers were interviewed again and were asked about the whereabouts of their client. The best they could come up with as an answer was that Santos was still pondering as what to do next. I would have thought that as her lawyers and also as agents of the court, these defense attorneys should know better and instead advise their client to surrender instead of drawing the ire of the court, but I digress. On the 19th of July, the police headed to Naga City to search the home where Santos and Griffiths used to stay, but they were dismayed because Santos was not there. They also searched another house known to be Santos's childhood home, but she was not there either. So the police continued their search for her, knowing that the 10-day deadline was fast approaching. 2 days later, Santos still had not surrendered herself, and the police had also failed to locate her. It was becoming increasingly clear that the police would have to return the search warrant to the court in order to apply for a so-called alias warrant. This is a warrant that would empower police authorities all around the country to search and arrest Santos. By the 26th of July, news broke that the UK police authorities had released Griffiths from his police bail and the investigation into his person had ceased. The police in the UK did not find any grounds to continue their investigation, but they promised that if a government-to-government agreement was struck between the UK and the Philippines, they would help arrest and extradite Griffiths. Representatives of the Philippine government told the media that they were preparing the necessary documents to initiate such an agreement. The news about Griffiths must have been a tough blow to Ella's family, I'm sure, but having said all that, there was an even bigger problem Ella's family had to deal with, or rather, the police had to deal with. By the 28th of July 2011, Santos was still MIA and unwilling to surrender. This, of course, posed a problem for the police and the prosecution, who could not start a trial without her. As July turned into August, there was still no news about any arrest. However, the media was suddenly abuzz again because Santos's lawyers went public and revealed that DNA testing done on some blood samples taken from the back of Santos's pajero and other items had now yielded results. Oddly enough, the police would not reveal the results to the public nor to the defense lawyers. When asked about the results of the DNA test, the police sounded rather defensive. They said that everything would be revealed in the trial, but surely they must have known that soon enough, and at the latest during pre-trial discovery, they would need to pass all of their evidence to the defense. The police, and this is just my personal take on it, seemed to think that it did not really matter what the DNA test result was. The eyewitnesses they had were enough to get a conviction. Now, this is rather disconcerting because certainly, as we know now, eyewitness accounts are considered less reliable than any type of other evidence, especially when compared to DNA evidence, presuming, of course, this was done right and tested without contamination. Regardless of DNA results, none of that mattered anyway at that time, seeing as Santos was still in the wind. The police at some point ended up putting a reward for any tips and information about Santos, and no progress was made until October 2011. On the 7th of October, Bella Ruby Santos was finally apprehended at a mall in Mandaluyong. 3 days later, she was flown back to Cebu. Her lawyers, of course, immediately got to work to get the case against her dropped and to also have her released. However, both kidnapping and murder are non-bailable offenses, and so this was unlikely to be granted anyway. Her lawyers also applied for a prison transfer from Cebu to Naga, where she will be closer to her family. As for the arrest itself, this was made possible by an informant whose name or details the police refused to reveal. The tipster apparently called in Santos's location after it became clear that she was not in Cebu anymore, but had flown to many places including Boracay and then eventually to Manila where she was arrested. With Santos in custody, the public now also wanted to know what was being done with Griffiths. It would come to no one's surprise that by October 2011, the application to the UK government still had not been made, delaying yet again the process in this case. Meanwhile, Santos, having arrived back in Visayas, was finally allowed to be detained in Naga. The judge in Cebu decided this was the right thing to do because Naga City has jurisdiction over crimes which happened in Minglanilla. Meanwhile, the prosecutors assigned to the case were gearing up for the trial, which was scheduled when it became clear that Santos had been arrested. In the meantime, another development took place in the matter of Ian Griffiths. By the 20th of October, he was put on Interpol's Red Notice list. According to the Interpol website, a Red Notice is a request to law enforcement worldwide to locate and provisionally arrest a person pending extradition, surrender, or similar legal action. Furthermore, Red Notices are published by Interpol at the request of a member country, like the Philippines, and this Red Notice must comply with Interpol's constitution and rules. However, a Red Notice is not an international arrest warrant. For the time being then, Griffiths was on this list, preventing him from traveling outside the UK, where he could potentially be extradited back to the Philippines. On the 24th of October 2011, Bella Ruby Santos was finally arraigned. She pleaded not guilty to all charges. The trial started shortly after. Reports from 2011 indicated that the witnesses gave their testimonies to the court and were cross-examined all throughout November and December, making sure there was ample time in between to allow the underage witnesses to recover from the strain of being in court. And this essentially brings us to 2012. As the first anniversary of Ella's death approached in February 2012, it became clear that the trial was nowhere near finished. I do not need to tell you that letting a criminal trial go on for this long is essentially like denying justice to those who deserve it. From a fiscal point of view, you are looking at an exorbitant amount of taxpayers' money being spent on a trial that could easily wrap up in a year if the system actually worked properly. Instead, taxpayers' money go to waste and people go bankrupt from paying their lawyers. In this case, there was another negative consequence of having such a prolonged trial. Ella's family became vulnerable and susceptible to harassment by supporters of Bella Ruby Santos. The ramifications of a prolonged trial are far-reaching and cannot be underestimated. By April 2012, we finally heard a little bit more about what was going on in the case. Firstly, Ian Griffiths was still in the UK, and the process of getting him into the Philippines was somehow taking ages. The Justice Department, through Leila de Lima, continued to promise that they were doing everything to extradite Griffiths, but after a year, the promises sounded hollow. It was also in April that we learned a little bit more about how Ella died. Forensic examiners concluded that Ella may have been killed by more than one person. Ella's injuries, according to the medical examiner, were consistent with a body hurt and killed by at least two people. He stated that it was possible that one person held Ella's arms whilst another person hit her head, which ultimately caused her death. The medical examiner also specified that upon closer examination, it was clear that the injury sustained specifically to the right side of the back portion of Ella's head was the one that proved fatal. Apart from that injury, Ella also sustained concussions on her right cheek and chin, and also she suffered bruises on her arms. By May 2012, news broke out yet again about this case following a rather hectic day in court when one of the prosecution witnesses was suddenly rushed to the hospital. The witness, a man named Richard Ian Bansuan, testified that after attending a party, he headed back home at around 11:45 in the evening on the 8th of February. He saw a black Pajero parked at the curb of the road he was on. Bansuan said that he slowly pulled over his motorcycle meters away from the Pajero and saw a Filipino woman and a foreign man inside it. He said that the vehicle's lighting was on inside and the pair was clear to see. Bansuan said that he was sure Griffith saw him looking at them from around 50 meters away. Whilst this may sound pretty innocuous on its own, his testimony did have one important aspect. Bansuan said that he saw Ian Griffiths walk to the back of the Pajero to lift a sack out of the car and throw said sack over the cliff in that area. On its own, the testimony seemed straightforward and damning for Griffiths and Santos, but Bansuan was extremely rattled and nervous, not only during his testimony but also during cross-examination. He was sweating profusely, using his inhaler at times because of difficulties breathing, and he did not get to finish his testimony. At some point, it became clear to the people in the court that he was having an asthma attack, and he was eventually rushed to the hospital. Ella's family was sympathetic, but the defense called Bansuan's testimony quote-unquote meatless, and his behavior was described as artistahin, meaning he was just acting or faking it. The defense was, in my opinion, implying that Bansuan was so affected by his appearance and performance in court because his testimony was, in essence, a fabrication. This is an interesting take, of course. By June 2012, we learned that Santos applied for bail, whilst the prosecution continued to present witnesses to support their case. This included a 9-year-old girl and a motorcycle driver. A month after, in July, Richard Ian Bansuan, after having been admitted to the hospital in May, took the stand again to continue where he left off before he had an asthma attack. Now, remember that DNA test from August 2011? Well, we finally got to learn the result of it a year later in August 2012. It was negative. Specifically, the DNA test results of items owned by Bella Santos showed no traces of bloodstains from Ella. This was a huge disappointment and setback for the prosecution, who I thought would have known about this result for a year already. Naturally, the defense were up in arms about this and wanted the case against Santos dismissed. The prosecutors did not see this as a setback at all, let alone a reason to dismiss the case. The prosecution said that whilst the items tested did not contain any DNA traces of Ella, this merely meant that Ella did not come in contact with those items specifically. The results did not categorically eliminate any involvement by Santos and Griffiths. I can absolutely understand that point of view, but then it does beg the question why there was no other DNA test conducted on other items plausibly deemed as having any trace of Ella. In any case, this evidence was now part of the trial, and it did encourage and embolden the defense in their application for bail. The bail hearing took place on the 7th of August and quickly became media fodder due to the lawyers arguing heatedly and, as the presiding judge would say, arguing like children. The lawyers kept making snide remarks against each other, which obviously did not land well with the judge. Needless to say, no decision as to the bail application was made that day. Now, further prosecution witnesses were heard all throughout August, September, and October. By November, the prosecution presented their final witness, and the court informed the defense that they were now allowed to present their witnesses by the 28th of January 2013. And so the year 2012 drew to an end, with justice still very much absent for little Ellah Joy Pique. By January and February 2013, it is my understanding that Santos's bail application was still pending, and for the purpose of the bail hearing, the prosecution was yet again presenting witnesses. The presentation of witnesses is wholly separate from the main case. When March came around, the Ellah Joy Pique case made headlines yet again when the media was told that the Pique family was seeking 5 million pesos in damages from Bella Santos. The family justified this amount by saying that it would include funeral and burial costs plus any income Ella might have had she not died. This amount would later be lowered to 3.4 million pesos. This, of course, being the minimum amount the family was demanding from Santos. The defense said that they were not opposed to this amount because their client was innocent anyway, something that I would not have thought the defense would say, given that agreeing to a certain amount for the purposes of damages could be seen by others as an admission of guilt. Nevertheless, it would have been explained to the Pique family that if Santos was convicted, the decision of the court would include an order for Santos to pay damages anyway. Now, going back to the bail application and the bail hearing, we know that in March, this was still very much underway and no decision had been made. But this would change in the summer of 2013. The Pique family experienced a setback when Santos was finally granted bail in April. Lawyers for the prosecution asked the court to reconsider their decision, fearing that Santos was a flight risk. I think the fear was justified given her behavior after the arrest warrant was issued nearly 2 years prior. She obviously knew how to hide in plain sight and only made the mistake of being too bold by visiting a mall, after which she was then arrested. Nevertheless, the court ruled that evidence presented by the prosecution for the purpose of arguing that Santos should be kept in detention was weak, and Santos was allowed to go home pending the result of the main case. And so Santos posted bail and paid 500,000 pesos instead of the original 5 million peso bail amount. She was temporarily free. Now, the prosecution, following this setback, realized that since the court thought their case was weak, even though this was a comment made in the context of the bail hearing, they needed to step up their game. They asked the court if they could present more witnesses. The defense objected to this, but the court eventually allowed this in the interest of justice. And so, further witnesses were presented to the court by July. And then, for most of 2013 and 2014, the trial barely made a splash in the media, except for a court application made by the defense in July 2014. In July 2014, the defense filed a so-called demur to evidence, which basically asked the court to dismiss the case even before the defense could present its evidence, seeing as the prosecution's evidence was not enough to secure a conviction, in their opinion. The decision of the court would not be handed down until much later in October 2014. On the 10th of October 2014, the judge cleared Bella Santos, much to the dismay of the prosecution and the Pique family. Judge Esther Veloso stated that she was not convinced by the testimony of the child witness who claimed that Santos abducted Ella back in 2011. The charges of kidnapping and homicide were therefore dismissed. The hold and departure order was lifted, and the cash bond paid by Santos after she was successful in her bail application was ordered to be returned to her. Judge Veloso delivered a scathing criticism of the prosecution's case and its heavy reliance on the testimony of a sixth grader. Judge Veloso also found it problematic that the two other children, the twins who were with Ella and this other sixth grader the day Ella was abducted, identified a different couple. Remember Sven Eric Berger and Karen S. Jolon? The main question for the judge was essentially, why should she believe the sixth grader over the twins when they all had a different recollection about who abducted Ella in the first place? The decision was a major slap in the face to the PNP. Back in 2011, when Sven Eric Berger and Karen S. Drilon were arrested and put in front of the twin witnesses for identification, it became clear to some members of the investigating task force that they probably had the wrong couple. This had ramifications for the task force after it was proven that the couple was innocent. As I mentioned earlier in the episode, the police superintendent resigned as there was a loss of confidence in him, especially by the local government. It was felt then, back in 2011, and more so in 2014, that Director Erson Digal, the superintendent who first handled the case, wanted the case to be over quickly and did not care who got arrested as long as an arrest was made. Governor Gwen Garcia reprimanded him for this back then. It was at this crossroads in this case that the prosecution really had an uphill battle in winning this case. The case was bungled already back in 2011, whether the prosecution wanted to admit that or not. The PNP did not do their due diligence and most probably lacked the important forensic skills as well for such a complex and major case. As a result, the case was doomed from the very beginning. This case was, for all intents and purposes, done at this point. Only in a conviction can an appeal be made, and so that option was and is still not open to the prosecution. And whilst it became quiet on this front after 2014, this case was suddenly brought back to the forefront after Ian Griffiths expressed the wish to be tried for this case either in the Philippines or the UK. This was back in 2017. His lawyer in the Philippines explained that Griffiths still maintained his innocence but pointed out that there is an intention there to be tried because he wanted to prove this innocence. And so the motion to make this happen was filed with the court after the lawyer was prompted by his client. Apparently, Ian Griffiths had become weary at being restricted in his movements, especially when it comes to traveling. This tells us that Griffiths, even after the dismissal of the case against Santos in 2014, was still restricted or perhaps under police surveillance to some degree. At the very least, this tells us that he was still on the red notice list by the Interpol. Now, there's no update as to whether Griffiths ever got his day in court, but I suspect he has not. According to some blogs and forums, he was eventually taken off the red notice list, which indicates to me that maybe the Philippine government was not interested in pursuing him anymore, and the motion he filed back in 2017 was denied. Of course, I could not find any reliable source that would confirm this, so I went on Interpol's red notice list directly and searched for Griffith's name. He is not on the list anymore. We could de facto take this as a confirmation that there's no push anymore from the prosecutors in Cebu or Naga to reopen this case. But you know what is really scary and unsettling about how this case turned out? Ellah Joy Pique's killer or killers are most probably still out there, driving around looking for their next young victim. Lagim fam, thank you so much for listening to this anniversary episode. I may have already said this in my Instagram post last Saturday, but thank you so much for all the support this past year. Podcasting has opened up such wonderful opportunities for me, and I want to continue doing this for as long as I can. I cannot help but think back on the evening I released episode 1 or even the trailer. Suddenly, everything became very real, and I felt a sense of responsibility in telling these stories as truthfully as my research empowered me to. I may not be the podcaster with the snazzy sound effects, the best microphone, or even the most dramatic writing style, but what I hope you have noticed this past year is that I have a great passion and dedication for what I do. I have and will continue to improve on these new podcasting skills, and I hope you will be there to tag along this ride with me. Thank you very much, Lagim fam, from the bottom of my true crime loving heart. Daghang salamat, maraming salamat, at mabuhay.